Welcome, and thank you for being here. Tonight's story is not about dramatic disasters, famous battles, or moments when history exploded into chaos. Instead, it is about something quieter, subtler, and in many ways far more exhausting. It is about rules. Not laws written in stone or proclamations announced to crowds, but invisible rules that shaped everyday life, especially for women working behind desks in the 1950s. Rules that governed posture, tone, appearance, timing, and even facial expressions. Rules so detailed and relentless that following them became a full-time occupation in itself. Imagine stepping into an office in the mid-1950s. The air hums with the sound of typewriters, the steady ticking of wall clocks, and the faint smell of paper, ink, and reheated coffee. At first glance, everything looks orderly, even elegant. Desks are neat. Employees are well dressed. Smiles appear polite and effortless. It seems like a well-oiled machine, calm and professional. But beneath that surface lies a world held together by strict expectations and unspoken demands, especially for the secretaries who kept the entire operation running. In popular memory, the 1950s office is often portrayed as glamorous. Pencil skirts, tidy hair, polished shoes, and sleek machines. Yet glamour came at a cost. For secretaries, the job was not simply about typing letters or answering phones. It was about performing perfection every single day. One small mistake, one moment of visible fatigue, or one deviation from the unwritten code could quietly follow you for weeks, sometimes months. These offices ran on rules, far more rules than most modern workplaces would tolerate. Some were written in manuals and training guides. Others were passed down through whispers, raised eyebrows, or the subtle silence that followed a misstep. Together, they formed a rigid system designed to maintain order, authority, and appearances at all costs. From the moment a secretary woke up in the morning, the rules were already at work. How early to rise. What to wear. How to prepare oneself not just physically, but emotionally, for the day ahead. Reliability was not a trait. It was an expectation. Dependability was assumed, not praised. Being on time was not enough. You had to be early. And not just early, but effortlessly early, as if punctuality were part of your personality rather than the result of careful planning and quiet anxiety. Once inside the office, the rules multiplied. How to sit. How to stand. How to walk down a hallway. How to greet colleagues. How quickly to answer the phone. How warmly to speak, even when the words were repetitive, even when the requests were unreasonable, even when your energy was already fading. In this environment, professionalism was measured not only by skill, but by composure. And composure meant control of your body, your voice, and your expressions. The role of the secretary occupied a strange space in the hierarchy. Secretaries were essential. Offices could not function without them. They managed schedules, filtered communication, maintained records, and often understood the workflow better than anyone else in the room. And yet, they were expected to remain nearly invisible. Efficient but quiet. Capable but deferential. Knowledgeable but never authoritative. Their success was defined by how smoothly things ran, not by recognition or advancement. This contradiction shaped the rules. A secretary had to be alert at all times, yet never appear rushed. She had to anticipate needs before they were spoken, but never seem presumptuous. She had to smile constantly, but never draw attention to herself. The balance was delicate and exhausting. Too much enthusiasm could be seen as inappropriate. Too little could be labeled uncooperative. The correct tone lived in a narrow space that required constant self-monitoring. These expectations were reinforced by a culture that prized uniformity. The office was not a place for individuality. Personal preferences, moods, or off days were treated as inconveniences rather than human realities. Emotional consistency mattered. A cheerful demeanor was considered part of the job description. Fatigue, frustration, or quiet resistance had no official place in the workday. Training materials from the era often emphasized attitude just as much as ability. A good secretary was described not only as accurate and fast, but as pleasant, agreeable, and calm under pressure. These traits were framed as professional virtues, even though they demanded continuous emotional labor. The effort required to maintain that demeanor rarely appeared in job descriptions, yet it was understood by everyone who worked there. Rules also served another purpose: control. By standardizing behavior, appearance, and conduct, companies reinforced clear boundaries of authority. Managers gave instructions. Secretaries followed them. The structure was predictable but rigid. Advancement opportunities were limited, and expectations were high. In many cases, secretaries were evaluated not only on performance, but on how well they embodied the image the company wanted to project. What makes these rules particularly striking is how ordinary they were. There were no dramatic punishments, no public trials. Consequences were often subtle: a note in a file, a shift in tone, a missed opportunity. Yet the pressure was constant. It lived in the background, shaping decisions large and small. What time to leave the house? Whether to speak up? How to react when plans changed without warning? And still, many secretaries navigated this world with skill and resilience. They learned the rhythms of the office. They memorized preferences. They developed systems, shortcuts, and quiet forms of solidarity. In between the rules, they found moments of pride in doing their work well, even when recognition was scarce. Looking back, it is easy to dismiss these rules as outdated or extreme. But they offer a revealing glimpse into how workplaces once functioned, and how expectations, especially for women, were tightly bound to ideas of appearance, behavior, and obedience. The 1950s office was not just a place of work. It was a carefully managed environment where conformity was rewarded and deviation was quietly corrected. Tonight's story is an invitation to step into that world, to slow down and observe how everyday routines were shaped by invisible boundaries, to consider how much effort it took to appear effortless, and to recognize that behind every neatly typed memo and perfectly answered phone call was a person navigating a complex web of expectations. So as we continue, imagine the hum of machines, the steady march of the clock, and the unspoken understanding that everything must look just right. This is where the story begins, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a system of rules so thorough that they defined an entire way of working, and for many, an entire way of being. The first thing that defined a secretary in the 1950s was not her typing speed, her organizational skill, or her understanding of office routines. It was how she looked the moment she walked through the door. Appearance was not a personal choice. It was a professional requirement, carefully shaped by expectations that were rarely questioned and almost never relaxed. Clothing, hair, makeup, posture, and even subtle details like shoe height or fabric texture became part of an unspoken uniform designed to communicate obedience, competence, and restraint. The office dress code of the 1950s did not need to be posted on a wall to be understood. It was absorbed through training manuals, workplace culture, and constant observation. A secretary was expected to look neat, feminine, and conservative at all times. This balance was strict. Too plain could be interpreted as careless or dull. Too stylish risked being labeled inappropriate or distracting. The goal was to blend into the office environment while still representing the company's image of professionalism. Skirts were expected to fall below the knee. Not just at the knee, but safely below it, allowing no room for interpretation. Blouses were modest, with high necklines and sleeves that avoided drawing attention. Fabrics were chosen carefully, nothing sheer, nothing overly textured, nothing that wrinkled easily. Every detail mattered because every detail was visible in a workplace built on observation. A secretary sat where she could be seen, evaluated, and corrected without words. Shoes followed their own rules. Heels were encouraged, but not too high. Flats were acceptable in some offices, but often considered less polished. Shoes had to be clean, quiet, and practical enough for long hours, yet still graceful. Scuffed heels or worn soles were small signs of failure, suggesting a lack of care or preparation. Even the sound of footsteps mattered. A good secretary moved efficiently. Without drawing attention, her presence registered only when needed. Hair was another silent standard. It had to be clean, controlled, and styled in a way that stayed in place throughout the day. Loose strands, overly elaborate styles, or anything that required frequent adjustment were discouraged. Hair represented discipline. A tidy hairstyle suggested a tidy mind. It communicated reliability before a single word was spoken. The effort required to maintain that appearance, especially through long workdays, was invisible but constant. Makeup, though rarely mentioned directly, was assumed. A natural, polished look was the expectation. Not wearing makeup could be interpreted as unprofessional, while wearing too much risked judgment. Lipstick shades, eyebrow shapes, and even nail color were quietly monitored. Neutral tones were safest. Bright colors were risky. Everything was meant to signal that the secretary understood her role and respected the boundaries that came with it. Accessories followed similar rules. Jewelry was permitted, but minimal. A small necklace, modest earrings, a watch nothing that made noise, reflected too much light, or invited comment. Bags had to be practical yet discreet. Nothing flashy. Nothing oversized. The goal was always the same: presentable, controlled, and unremarkable. These expectations were not enforced by constant supervision, but by awareness. Secretaries learned to evaluate themselves through the imagined gaze of others. Before leaving home, they checked hems, collars, and seams. During the day, they adjusted posture, smoothed skirts, and maintained composure even when uncomfortable. The body itself became part of the job, something to be managed as carefully as paperwork or schedules. The dress code also reinforced hierarchy. Executives wore suits that symbolized authority and permanence. Secretaries wore clothing that emphasized support and service. Their appearance was designed to complement, not compete. Femininity was encouraged, but only in a controlled form that posed no challenge to power structures. Looking attractive was acceptable, even expected, as long as it remained non-threatening and secondary. What made these rules especially powerful was how closely appearance was tied to judgment. A well-dressed secretary was assumed to be capable. A poorly dressed one, even by minor standards, risked being seen as careless or unreliable. Mistakes in clothing carried moral weight, suggesting flaws in character rather than simple oversight. This connection between appearance and competence placed enormous pressure on daily presentation. Weather, personal circumstances, or physical discomfort rarely mattered. Heat did not excuse loosened standards. Fatigue did not justify neglect. The office demanded consistency, and appearance was a visible measure of that consistency. To look perfect was to prove commitment. To fall short was to invite quiet criticism. The uniformity created by these dress codes also erased individuality. Personal style had little room to exist. Clothing choices were guided by what was acceptable, not what was comfortable or expressive. Over time, this shaped identity. Many secretaries learned to separate who they were from who they appeared to be at work. The office version of themselves followed rules that had little to do with personal preference. Yet within these constraints, subtle adaptations emerged. Slight variations in fabric, a carefully chosen pin, or a familiar silhouette allowed for quiet self-expression. These small choices became meaningful because the space for them was so limited. They were not acts of rebellion, but acts of survival, ways to maintain a sense of self within a tightly controlled environment. The dress code also extended beyond clothing. Posture mattered. Sitting upright, standing smoothly, and walking with purpose were all part of the visual language of professionalism. Slouching suggested laziness. Rushed movements suggested disorganization. Everything was meant to look calm, intentional, and composed. Even when the workload was overwhelming, the body was expected to communicate ease. Over time, these expectations shaped how secretaries were perceived both inside and outside the office. Their appearance became symbolic of order, reliability, and restraint. The image was so strong that it influenced popular culture, advertising, and social assumptions about women's work. The secretary was not just a job role, but a visual archetype. Looking back, the strictness of these appearance standards reveals more than fashion preferences. It shows how control was maintained through everyday details. Clothing became a tool for enforcing behavior, reinforcing hierarchy, and shaping identity. The effort required to meet these standards was constant, yet rarely acknowledged. It was simply assumed. This focus on appearance also set the tone for everything that followed. It established expectations before a task was even assigned. It communicated who belonged, who complied, and who understood the unspoken rules of the workplace. By the time a secretary sat at her desk, her role had already been defined by how she looked. In this way, the dress code was not superficial. It was foundational. It prepared secretaries to accept other forms of control over speech, time, and emotion. Appearance was the first lesson, the visible signal that conformity mattered and that the workplace valued image as much as function. From here, the story moves deeper into the daily realities of office life, where rules extended beyond clothing into behavior, communication, and silence itself. But it all began with how one looked, standing at the threshold of the office, perfectly dressed, carefully composed, and ready to disappear into the role that awaited her. Once appearance established that a secretary belonged in the office, behavior determined whether she would remain there comfortably. In the 1950s workplace, how a secretary spoke, moved, reacted, and even remained silent was governed by expectations just as strict as any dress code. Words mattered, but tone mattered more. Actions were observed, but restraint was valued above initiative. The ideal secretary was not the one who spoke the most clearly or acted the fastest, but the one whose presence never disrupted the smooth flow of authority. The voice was one of the most carefully controlled tools in a secretary's daily routine. When answering the telephone, it had to sound pleasant, calm, and composed regardless of circumstances. Fatigue, irritation, or urgency were not meant to be audible. The voice represented the office itself. A caller did not hear a person. They heard the company. Any hint of impatience or uncertainty reflected poorly on the entire organization, and responsibility for that impression rested almost entirely on the secretary. Phone etiquette manuals of the era emphasized consistency. The greeting should be clear and polite, spoken at a moderate pace, with a steady volume. Too soft suggested insecurity. Too loud suggested aggression. The correct tone existed in a narrow range that required constant awareness. Every call demanded performance, even when calls were repetitive, intrusive, or poorly timed. Interruptions were common, but reacting to them was not permitted. A secretary was expected to pause her work immediately, shift attention smoothly, and respond without visible frustration. The transition itself was important. Efficiency was expected to appear effortless. Rushed movements or sharp replies hinted at stress, which was seen as a failure of composure rather than a natural response to pressure. In face-to-face interactions, similar rules applied. A secretary was expected to speak when spoken to, respond clearly, and avoid unnecessary commentary. Offering opinions was risky. Asking questions required careful phrasing. Even clarification had to be delivered respectfully, without implying that instructions were unclear or flawed. The goal was always to support authority, never challenge it. Silence played an equally important role. Knowing when not to speak was considered a skill. Offices were filled with information conversations, documents, phone calls that passed through a secretary's hands daily. Discretion was assumed. Commenting on what was overheard, even casually, could damage trust. Silence was not only polite. It was essential to maintaining one's position. Body language reinforced these expectations. A secretary was expected to sit attentively, stand when addressed by superiors, and move purposefully through shared spaces. Lingering, leaning, or appearing idle could be misinterpreted. The body was expected to signal readiness at all times. Even moments of rest had to look productive. Facial expressions were part of this silent language. Smiling was encouraged, but not too broadly. Neutral expressions were acceptable, but not cold. Frowning, sighing, or showing visible confusion risked judgment. The face was meant to remain composed, reflecting calm competence regardless of internal state. Emotional discipline was not optional. It was part of the job. Mistakes, when they occurred, had to be handled quietly. Apologies were expected to be brief and sincere, without explanation unless requested. Defensiveness was unacceptable. Even when errors were caused by unclear instructions or last-minute changes, responsibility often fell on the secretary. Accepting blame gracefully was seen as professional maturity. Time management further shaped behavior. A secretary was expected to be available, but not intrusive. Knowing when to interrupt a superior and when to wait required intuition developed through observation rather than instruction. Interrupt too often, and you appeared incompetent. Wait too long, and you appeared inattentive. Success depended on reading subtle cues: tone of voice, body posture, timing of meetings. Interactions with colleagues followed their own hierarchy. Politeness was mandatory, but closeness had limits. Friendliness was acceptable, familiarity was not. The office was not a place for emotional expression or personal disclosure. Conversations were kept light, neutral, and brief. Personal problems were meant to remain invisible during working hours. This restraint extended even to moments of stress. Deadlines, errors, and conflicting demands were common, yet visible anxiety was discouraged. A good secretary was expected to absorb pressure without displaying it. Stress management was individual, private, and unsupported. The appearance of calm mattered more than actual well-being. These behavioral expectations reinforced the power structure of the office. Executives were allowed urgency, frustration, and directness. Secretaries were expected to absorb those emotions and respond with steadiness. Emotional labor flowed in one direction. The role required constant adjustment, anticipation, and self-control, yet rarely received acknowledgement. Over time, these habits became ingrained. Many secretaries learned to monitor themselves automatically, adjusting tone and posture without conscious thought. The rules became internalized, shaping not only work behavior but personal identity. The line between professional conduct and personal suppression grew thin. Yet within this system, quiet competence flourished. Secretaries developed remarkable awareness, memory, and adaptability. They learned to manage complex interactions with minimal authority, relying on timing, tone, and silence. Their influence was subtle but significant, even if rarely recognized. Looking back, these behavioral rules reveal how much of office life depended on invisible labor. The smooth operation of daily routines relied not only on schedules and documents, but on emotional regulation performed quietly by those expected never to draw attention to themselves. As the story continues, these expectations begin to intersect more directly with power, hierarchy, and long-term limitations. The rules governing voice and behavior were not isolated. They prepared secretaries for a workplace where advancement was constrained and obedience was rewarded more reliably than excellence. The structure of the 1950s office was built on clear lines of authority, and everyone was expected to know exactly where they stood. Titles mattered. Desks were arranged to reflect rank. Doors, windows, and proximity to leadership silently communicated power. Within this system, the secretary occupied a position that was both central and constrained. She was close to decision-making, yet excluded from it. She handled information, yet did not own it. She enabled authority, yet rarely possessed any herself. Hierarchy defined daily interactions. Executives gave instructions. Managers relayed them. Secretaries executed them. This flow was rarely questioned and almost never reversed. Even when a secretary had more experience, institutional knowledge, or practical understanding than the person giving orders, the expectation remained the same: follow directions precisely, without correction or commentary. This imbalance was reinforced through routine. A secretary often knew which meetings mattered, which calls should be prioritized, and which deadlines were flexible. She understood personalities, conflicts, and patterns. Yet offering unsolicited guidance was risky. Advice had to be framed carefully, often disguised as clarification or confirmation. Direct recommendations could be interpreted as overstepping. Physical space reinforced these limits. Secretaries were usually positioned outside private offices or in shared work areas. Their desks acted as gateways controlling access while remaining exposed. This placement symbolized their role: close enough to be useful, far enough to remain subordinate. Privacy was rare. Visibility was constant. Power dynamics also shaped how credit and blame were distributed. Success was often attributed upward. Smooth operations reflected well on leadership. Failures, delays, or miscommunications frequently settled downward. When things went wrong, responsibility was absorbed quietly. When things went right, silence was expected. Advancement opportunities reflected this hierarchy. For many secretaries, career progression was limited by design. The role was seen as a destination, not a stepping stone. Ambition beyond the position was often discouraged, subtly or directly. Training focused on improving performance within the role, not preparing for transition out of it. Educational background did not always change these limits. Even secretaries with strong academic credentials found their options constrained by assumptions about gender and suitability. Leadership roles were framed as incompatible with the supportive, deferential image assigned to secretarial work. Skill did not automatically translate into opportunity. Performance evaluations reinforced compliance over growth. Reliability, loyalty, and attitude were praised. Initiative was acceptable only within narrow boundaries. Questioning procedures or suggesting improvements required careful timing and wording. Too much confidence could be misread as arrogance. Too little could be interpreted as incompetence. This system created a paradox. Offices depended on secretaries for continuity and efficiency, yet resisted granting them authority or autonomy. Their influence was real but informal. It existed in timing, access control, and quiet negotiation rather than official power. This influence was tolerated as long as it remained invisible. Gender expectations further solidified these boundaries. The secretary's role aligned with cultural ideas about women as supportive, organized, and accommodating. Authority, decision-making, and leadership were associated with masculinity. Challenging this division risked social and professional consequences. Even language reflected hierarchy. Titles were used carefully. First names and surnames signaled status. Tone shifted depending on rank. A secretary adjusted speech patterns constantly, navigating a landscape where respect flowed upward and familiarity flowed downward. Despite these constraints, secretaries developed strategies to operate effectively within the system. They learned when to assert influence quietly, when to delay, and when to expedite. They understood that power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it moved through schedules, calendars, and gatekeeping. Yet these strategies did not dismantle the structure. They allowed survival and competence, not transformation. The limits remained firmly in place, reinforced by tradition, expectation, and unspoken agreement. For many, the ceiling was not just invisible, it was assumed. Over time, this hierarchy shaped how secretaries viewed their own potential. Repeated exposure to restricted roles and limited recognition narrowed expectations. Ambitions were adjusted to fit what seemed realistic. The office became a place of mastery within confinement rather than growth toward authority. Looking back, these invisible limits reveal how organizations maintained stability by controlling movement within the hierarchy. The secretary's role was essential precisely because it was fixed. Change threatened predictability, and predictability was valued above all. As the story continues, these power dynamics begin to intersect more directly with time: how long one stayed, what was expected over years of service, and how permanence without progress became another unspoken rule of office life. Time functioned differently for secretaries in the 1950s office. It was measured not only in hours and minutes, but in years of quiet consistency. From the beginning, there was an unspoken assumption that the role was not temporary. It was not framed as an early step in a longer career or a phase of exploration. Instead, it was treated as a position one would grow into, remain within, and eventually leave behind without ceremony. Daily schedules reflected this expectation. Secretaries were expected to arrive early, often before their supervisors, and remain available until the work was complete. The end of the day was not defined by a clock so much as by need. If a meeting ran late or correspondence remained unfinished, staying was assumed. Overtime was rarely discussed as an exception. It was absorbed into the rhythm of the job. Breaks existed, but they were brief and structured. Lunch hours were timed. Coffee breaks were informal yet monitored. Leaving the desk required explanation, even if only implied. Time away from work was treated as a disruption rather than a necessity. Efficiency was measured by presence as much as productivity. Over years, this pattern created a sense of permanence. Secretaries became fixtures within offices. They remembered past policies, former executives, and long-forgotten procedures. Their institutional memory grew deeper than that of many supervisors, yet it did not translate into authority. Longevity brought familiarity, not advancement. Loyalty was expected as a virtue. Staying with one company for many years was praised, even when roles and compensation remained unchanged. Leaving was often framed as a personal choice rather than a structural limitation. A secretary who remained was considered dependable. One who moved on risked being seen as unreliable or restless. This expectation of permanence shaped behavior. Secretaries learned to endure rather than challenge. Long-term stability mattered more than short-term improvement. Complaints were minimized. Adaptation was constant. The idea of demanding change conflicted with the image of loyalty the role required. Time also shaped how mistakes were remembered. Errors could linger in memory long after they were corrected. Reputation accumulated slowly and faded even more slowly. A single misstep could color perceptions for months. Consistency was the safest strategy. Doing the same thing well, day after day, reduced risk. Vacations existed, but taking them required careful planning. Absence meant disruption. A secretary's workload did not pause, it waited. Returning often meant catching up quietly, without complaint. Time off was allowed, but it was not encouraged to be restorative. The expectation was to return seamlessly, as if nothing had changed. The long view of employment also influenced personal life choices. Many secretaries were expected, implicitly, to organize their lives around work. Scheduling appointments, managing responsibilities, and planning personal commitments had to accommodate office needs. Work came first, not because it was stated explicitly, but because everything else adjusted around it. As years passed, this structure created a sense of professional stasis. Skills improved. Confidence grew. Yet titles remained the same. Raises, when they occurred, were modest. Recognition was subtle. The role matured while the position stayed fixed. This disconnect affected motivation. Pride in work remained, but ambition was often redirected. Excellence became about mastery rather than progression. Being indispensable replaced being promotable. This shift was not announced. It emerged gradually through experience. The passage of time also reinforced hierarchy. Younger employees entered with the same expectations, observing those who had stayed longest. Longevity became a signal of acceptance, not authority. The system sustained itself through repetition. Looking back, this expectation of permanence reveals how stability was maintained through predictability. Secretaries were the constant presence in a changing office world. Their reliability anchored the organization, even as their own growth remained constrained. As the story continues, time begins to intersect with personal boundaries, how the office extended into private life, and how the separation between work and self gradually blurred under the weight of constant expectation. In the 1950s office, the boundary between professional responsibility and personal life was thin, and for secretaries, it was often crossed without acknowledgement. The role demanded not only time and skill, but availability, mental, emotional, and sometimes personal. The office did not simply occupy working hours. It extended into habits, relationships, and identity. Secretaries were expected to anticipate needs, which required constant awareness beyond formal tasks. Remembering preferences, managing moods, and adjusting priorities became part of daily routine. This level of attentiveness made detachment difficult. The job followed them home in the form of unfinished tasks, upcoming meetings, and unspoken expectations. Personal time was shaped around work obligations. Appointments were scheduled carefully to avoid conflict. Family commitments were arranged with contingency in mind. Even evenings could be interrupted by last-minute requests or changes. The idea that work ended at a specific hour rarely applied. Availability was assumed, not negotiated. Emotional boundaries were equally blurred. Secretaries absorbed stress from multiple directions: managers, clients, colleagues, while expected to remain calm and composed. They became quiet stabilizers, smoothing tension without acknowledgement. Their emotional labor was constant, yet invisible, folded into the role as if it required no effort. Personal expression was limited during work hours, and over time, this restraint extended beyond the office. Many secretaries learned to compartmentalize feelings, postponing reactions until privacy allowed. This habit of suppression shaped how they processed frustration, disappointment, and even success. Emotional regulation became second nature. The office also influenced self-perception. Being consistently cast in a supportive role reinforced expectations about worth and contribution. Identity aligned with usefulness rather than autonomy. Achievements were measured by how well others functioned, not by individual recognition. Requests that extended beyond job descriptions were common. Organizing personal errands, managing social obligations, or handling sensitive matters blurred professional lines. Refusal was difficult. Saying no risked appearing incooperative. Compliance maintained harmony but eroded boundaries further. Privacy was limited. Phones rang. Conversations were overheard. Documents passed through many hands. Secretaries were entrusted with information yet rarely afforded confidentiality themselves. Their workspace was open, accessible, and constantly observed. Over time, these conditions normalized overextension. Being always available became a marker of dedication. Fatigue was internalized. Burnout had no language. The expectation was endurance, not balance. Despite this, many secretaries developed coping mechanisms. Small routines, brief moments of solitude, or quiet humor with colleagues offered relief. These strategies were subtle, personal, and rarely acknowledged, yet essential for sustainability. Looking back, the erosion of personal boundaries reveals how the role demanded more than labor. It required emotional presence and self-adjustment that extended beyond formal responsibilities. As the story continues, these blurred boundaries begin to intersect with recognition, how contribution was acknowledged, rewarded, or overlooked within a system that relied heavily on invisible effort. Recognition in the 1950s office was selective, directional, and carefully managed. It flowed upward, following titles and authority, rarely pausing to acknowledge the labor that sustained daily operations. For secretaries, contribution was expected to be seamless. When work was done well, it vanished into normalcy. When something failed, it became visible. This imbalance shaped how effort was valued and how success was defined. The ideal outcome of a secretary's work was that nothing appeared difficult. Meetings started on time. Messages were delivered accurately. Documents were prepared without error. Problems were resolved before they reached awareness. In this environment, effectiveness was measured by absence of confusion, delay, or disruption. The better a secretary performed, the less noticeable her work became. Praise, when it appeared, was often indirect. A smooth day reflected well on leadership. A well-run office suggested competent management. Compliments were framed broadly, attributed to teams or systems rather than individuals. Specific acknowledgement of secretarial labor was uncommon and brief. Gratitude existed, but it was understated, often folded into expectation. This pattern reinforced the idea that secretarial work was supportive rather than generative. The labor did not create outcomes. It enabled others to do so. As a result, recognition focused on decisions made, not on the infrastructure that allowed those decisions to happen. The calendar that prevented conflicts, the preparation that avoided errors, the communication that maintained clarity all remained in the background. When errors occurred, visibility shifted abruptly. A missed message, a scheduling conflict, or a typographical mistake drew attention. Responsibility was personal and immediate. Apologies were expected. Explanations were discouraged. The contrast between invisibility in success and visibility in failure reinforced caution. Risk-taking diminished. Innovation narrowed. Consistency became safer than improvement. Formal recognition systems reflected this imbalance. Performance reviews emphasized reliability, attitude, and cooperation. Excellence was defined as meeting expectations consistently rather than exceeding them creatively. Raises, when granted, were modest and infrequent. Promotions were rare. Recognition did not accumulate. It reset daily. Public acknowledgement posed another risk. Standing out could disrupt the balance of hierarchy. Excessive praise might imply importance beyond role boundaries. For this reason, recognition remained controlled, understated, and private when it occurred at all. The safest place for a secretary's contribution was within routine, not spotlight. This dynamic influenced motivation. Pride came from internal standards rather than external validation. Satisfaction was found in order maintained, not applause received. Many secretaries learned to value competence for its own sake, separating self-worth from recognition that rarely arrived. The absence of credit also shaped narratives about work. Office success stories highlighted leadership decisions, strategic insight, and visible authority. The labor that supported those outcomes remained unnamed. Over time, this omission became normalized. The story of the office excluded the hands that kept it functioning. Yet within this silence, expertise deepened. Secretaries developed systems, memory, and intuition that surpassed formal documentation. They knew which processes worked and which did not. They understood consequences before they unfolded. This knowledge, though powerful, remained unofficial. Its value was recognized informally but rarely institutionalized. Occasionally, recognition appeared during transitions, retirements, departures, anniversaries. Speeches thanked dedication and loyalty. Gifts were presented. These moments acknowledged time served rather than impact made. They marked endurance, not influence. The acknowledgement came at the end, not during the work itself. This delayed recognition reinforced the idea that contribution was cumulative, not momentary. Appreciation arrived after usefulness had ended. The structure did not reward ongoing excellence. It commemorated persistence. This shaped expectations and behavior throughout a career. Looking back, the quiet disappearance of secretarial contribution reveals how organizations depend on labor they rarely name. Recognition systems reflected power structures more than performance. What mattered most was not who made things work, but who was seen doing so. As the story continues, this lack of recognition intersects with change how shifting social norms, technology, and expectations began to challenge the assumptions that had long defined the role, and how the system responded when its quiet foundations were no longer invisible. Change rarely arrived suddenly in the 1950s office. It crept in quietly, almost politely, testing boundaries without announcing itself. New machines appeared. Procedures shifted. Social expectations outside the office began to move, even when the workplace itself seemed frozen in time. For secretaries, these changes created tension between tradition and adaptation, between roles that were assumed permanent and realities that were becoming harder to ignore. Technology was one of the first pressures. Electric typewriters, dictation machines, and improved filing systems promised efficiency, but they also increased expectations. Speed became measurable. Accuracy became non-negotiable. What was once impressive became standard. The tools meant to ease workload often intensified it, raising output without reducing responsibility. Mastery of new equipment was expected immediately, without formal recognition or adjustment. Despite this, authority structures remained unchanged. Technology enhanced productivity but did not redistribute power. Secretaries were trained to operate new systems, not to influence how they were used. The tools expanded capability without expanding voice. Efficiency improved, yet control remained centralized. Social change outside the office was equally subtle but persistent. Educational opportunities for women increased. Conversations about independence and fulfillment began to circulate, even if quietly. Some secretaries arrived with ambitions that extended beyond support roles. They noticed the mismatch between their skills and their limitations. This awareness did not always lead to action, but it altered perception. The role felt less inevitable, more constructed. Resistance to this shift was largely passive. Office culture relied on tradition and expectation rather than explicit enforcement. When boundaries were tested, correction was gentle but firm. Suggestions were deflected. Ambitions were redirected. The system did not argue. It absorbed and redirected energy back into familiar patterns. Change was also managed through language. New responsibilities were framed as extensions of existing roles rather than transformations. Increased workload became added trust. Expanded duties became professional growth, even when titles and compensation remained the same. Progress was described without being enacted. Some secretaries adapted by leaning into specialization. They became experts in systems, procedures, or specific departments. This expertise increased dependence but not authority. The organization benefited from continuity while maintaining hierarchy. Knowledge deepened, influence remained informal. Others began to leave. Quiet departures disrupted the assumption of permanence. Turnover challenged stability, though it was often explained as personal choice rather than systemic dissatisfaction. The office adjusted, training replacements to maintain routine. Change was managed by substitution, not reflection. Generational shifts further complicated expectations. Younger workers brought different assumptions about work and identity. They questioned norms that older employees had internalized. This created subtle friction differences in tone, priorities, and tolerance. The office responded by reinforcing standards, emphasizing professionalism as conformity. Despite resistance, the system could not remain untouched. Each adaptation, each departure, each new expectation altered the environment slightly. The structure held, but strain accumulated. The gap between role and reality widened. Change did not dismantle the system immediately. It softened edges, exposed inconsistencies, and created space for reconsideration. The unraveling was gradual, uneven, and often incomplete. Yet it marked a turning point, signaling that what had once seemed permanent was, in fact, contingent. As the story continues, this gradual shift leads toward endings: how careers concluded, how roles were remembered, and how the quiet labor of an era faded from view even as its influence persisted. Careers in the 1950s office rarely ended with clear closure or reflection. There were no dramatic final days, no careful accounting of contribution, no meaningful transition from role to legacy. For most secretaries, departure happened quietly, almost as discreetly as their daily labor. The ending mirrored the work itself: efficient, understated, and quickly absorbed by routine. Leaving an office often followed familiar patterns. Marriage, family obligations, health, or simple exhaustion were common reasons, though they were not always spoken openly. Sometimes the departure was framed as a natural progression, sometimes as a personal decision, sometimes as an unavoidable necessity. Rarely was it discussed as the conclusion of a long professional chapter deserving recognition. Notice was given politely. Files were organized. Instructions were written out carefully. The priority was continuity, not reflection. Ensuring that the office would function smoothly without disruption mattered more than marking the significance of the exit. The secretary's final act was often to erase the evidence of her own importance. Training a replacement became part of this process. Knowledge accumulated over years was condensed into lists, routines, and brief explanations. What could not be easily transferred: intuition, memory, judgment was lost quietly. The system accepted this loss as inevitable, trusting that structure would compensate for experience. Farewells were modest. A card circulated. A small gathering might be held. Speeches, if any, focused on loyalty and pleasant demeanor rather than specific achievements. Years of problem-solving, coordination, and emotional labor were summarized in a few general phrases. Appreciation was expressed, but depth was avoided. Once gone, the space filled quickly. A new secretary occupied the desk. The phone rang again. Files moved forward. The office resumed its rhythm. Absence was acknowledged briefly, then normalized. The machine continued, as it always had. This pattern reinforced the idea that individuals were interchangeable, even when they were not. The organization relied on systems rather than people, or so it believed. The loss of institutional memory was accepted as the cost of continuity. The value of long-term contribution was recognized only at its end, and even then, lightly. For those leaving, the transition was complex. Identity had been shaped by years of restraint, support, and invisibility. Stepping away required adjustment. Without the familiar structure, some felt relief. Others felt disorientation. The role had provided purpose, routine, and validation, even if recognition was limited. Retirement, when it occurred, followed similar patterns. It was marked, acknowledged, and then closed. The secretary's story did not enter official history. Records reflected dates, not influence. The archive preserved output, not effort. Looking back, these endings reveal how work was valued in terms of function rather than human impact. Careers concluded not with reflection, but with replacement. The office moved on, and the individual faded from view. As the story continues, what remains is memory: how this era of work is remembered, simplified, or forgotten, and what is lost when invisible labor disappears from the narrative of progress. What remained after the secretaries of the 1950s offices were gone was not their work, but an image. Memory did not preserve routines, discipline, or restraint. It preserved aesthetics. The tidy desks, the rhythmic typing, the polished appearance, and the illusion of calm efficiency became symbols of an era remembered as orderly and elegant. The reality behind that image gradually faded, replaced by nostalgia that softened its edges. Popular culture played a central role in shaping this memory. Films, advertisements, and later television shows portrayed secretaries as decorative fixtures within the workplace. They were efficient, cheerful, and effortlessly composed. Their labor appeared light, almost automatic. Stress, constraint, and emotional discipline rarely entered these depictions. What had once required constant effort was reimagined as natural grace. This nostalgia reframed discipline as charm. The strict rules governing appearance and behavior became visual shorthand for professionalism rather than control. The uniformity once enforced through expectation became a styled choice admired from a distance. In memory, the role looked simpler than it was. Stories of the office emphasized hierarchy without examining its consequences. Authority appeared stable and benevolent. Support roles were portrayed as fulfilling and uncomplicated. The imbalance between contribution and recognition was rarely addressed. Memory favored harmony over tension. Language also shifted. The word secretary came to evoke a specific image rather than a set of skills. Competence was assumed but undefined. The complexity of the role, the anticipation, coordination, and emotional regulation was compressed into stereotypes. What could not be seen was not remembered. Personal memories were shaped by this broader narrative. Former secretaries often described their work with a mix of pride and understatement. Difficulties were minimized. Endurance was reframed as normal. The culture of restraint extended into recollection, influencing how stories were told and which details were shared. Nostalgia also created distance. By focusing on surface elements, it separated the role from contemporary conversations about labor, equity, and recognition. The past was treated as closed, resolved, and irrelevant to present concerns. The systems that shaped the role were seen as historical curiosities rather than foundations of modern workplaces. Yet traces remained. Expectations around professionalism, appearance, and emotional control did not disappear. They evolved. Modern offices inherited habits without always acknowledging their origins. The invisible labor once performed by secretaries found new forms, often under new titles, but with familiar demands. Memory, selective by nature, preserved what was comfortable and erased what was challenging. The quiet effort that kept offices running did not fit neatly into nostalgic narratives. It required explanation, context, and acknowledgement of imbalance, things nostalgia tends to avoid. By remembering the image rather than the experience, society lost an opportunity to understand how work had been structured and who had carried its weight. The secretary became a symbol, not a story. A silhouette rather than a voice. As the story moves toward its conclusion, the final question is not what was lost when these roles faded, but what remains unexamined. The legacy of the 1950s office lives on, not in form, but in expectation. Understanding that legacy requires looking past nostalgia and into the quiet systems that shaped an entire way of working. When the traditional secretary role began to fade, it did not truly disappear. It transformed. Titles changed. Offices modernized. Technology reshaped daily tasks. Yet many of the expectations that once defined the role continued, quietly embedded in modern workplaces. What remained was not the image, but the structure of invisible labor. The responsibilities once assigned to secretaries were redistributed rather than eliminated. Scheduling, coordination, communication management, emotional regulation, and anticipation of needs became shared expectations, often without formal recognition. These tasks were no longer confined to a single role, but they still existed, woven into job descriptions under neutral language like multitasking, soft skills, or team support. Professionalism continued to be defined by composure. Calm under pressure remained a virtue. Emotional expression was still regulated, though less explicitly. The expectation to manage stress privately, to appear capable without showing strain, carried forward from earlier office culture. What had once been demanded of secretaries became normalized across roles. Appearance standards evolved but did not vanish. Dress codes relaxed in form but retained underlying assumptions about credibility, respectability, and belonging. The body remained part of professional evaluation, even when rules were no longer written. The legacy of control shifted from uniformity to interpretation, requiring individuals to self-regulate rather than conform visibly. Hierarchy also persisted, though less rigidly labeled. Decision-making authority remained concentrated, while coordination and execution were widely distributed. Those who ensured smooth operation often remained less visible than those who received credit. The pattern of recognition continued to favor outcomes over infrastructure. The language of opportunity replaced the language of permanence, but limits remained. Advancement pathways expanded in theory, yet structural barriers endured. Informal labor organizing, mediating, remembering continued to be undervalued because it resisted measurement. What could not be quantified struggled to be rewarded. Memory played a role in this continuity. By treating the past as resolved, organizations avoided examining inherited practices. The emotional and cognitive labor once expected of secretaries was reframed as personal competence rather than structural demand. Responsibility shifted from system to individual. This legacy shaped modern burnout. The expectation to be always available, responsive, and adaptable echoed earlier demands, now amplified by constant connectivity. The boundary between work and self blurred further, not because of explicit rules, but because of internalized standards. Yet awareness grew alongside this continuity. Conversations about invisible labor, recognition, and equity began to surface. The quiet legacy of the secretary role provided historical context for these discussions, even if rarely acknowledged directly. Understanding this connection reframes the past. The 1950s office was not an isolated moment, but a foundation. Its systems did not vanish. They evolved. The labor that once disappeared into routine still does, under different names and expectations. The final idea completes this reflection not by returning to the past, but by considering what it asks of the present. The story of the 1950s office does not end with the disappearance of the secretary's desk or the modernization of workplace titles. It ends with a question that was never formally asked, because the system did not encourage asking it. What happens when essential work is designed to be unseen? And what does it mean for a society when entire forms of labor are valued only when they remain invisible? For decades, the smooth functioning of offices depended on people whose success was measured by absence of problems, delays, and disruption. Their work was meant to dissolve into routine, leaving no trace of effort behind. This expectation shaped not only how jobs were performed, but how worth was understood. Value was assigned to outcomes, not to the conditions that made those outcomes possible. When the role faded, the question did not disappear with it. Instead, it followed the work into new forms. Coordination became collaboration. Support became teamwork. Emotional regulation became professionalism. The language changed, but the expectation remained. Essential labor should not demand attention. The silence surrounding this question is telling. Systems rarely examine what benefits them most. By keeping certain forms of work unacknowledged, organizations preserved efficiency without confronting imbalance. The cost was carried privately, absorbed into individual endurance rather than shared responsibility. Looking back is not an exercise in judgment, but in clarity. The women who filled these roles were not passive participants in a flawed system. They were skilled navigators of constraint, operating within the limits available to them. Their competence sustained institutions that rarely paused to consider how much depended on them. The absence of dramatic conflict in this story is part of its meaning. Change did not arrive through confrontation, but through gradual accumulation of awareness, dissatisfaction, and shifting expectations. The system unraveled not because it was attacked, but because it could no longer hide its foundations. What remains is the opportunity to see work differently. To recognize that smooth operations are not automatic. They are built, maintained, and often protected by people whose names do not appear in summaries or reports. Acknowledging that labor changes how value is assigned. The 1950s office offers a quiet lesson. When work is structured to disappear, so do the people who perform it. Memory becomes selective. History simplifies. Progress moves forward without fully understanding what it rests upon. The story ends not with a conclusion, but with awareness. The question left behind is not about the past alone. It asks what forms of invisible labor exist now, who performs them, and how long they will remain unnamed. Understanding that question does not require nostalgia or condemnation. It requires attention. And attention, unlike routine, has the power to make what was once invisible finally seen. Taken together, this story is not really about a single decade, a single job, or a single group of people. It is about how systems quietly decide whose work is visible and whose is meant to fade into the background. The 1950s office simply makes that pattern easier to see. Its rules were clearer, its expectations more rigid, and its silence more complete. But the structure itself was not unique to that era. Behind every orderly workplace, past or present, there are forms of labor designed to disappear once they succeed. Schedules that never clash, conversations that never escalate, problems that never reach the surface. When these things work, they are rarely noticed. When they fail, they suddenly become urgent. This imbalance has shaped how work is rewarded, remembered, and valued for generations. The secretaries of that era carried this burden with precision and restraint. Their contribution was not loud enough to become legend, yet not small enough to be ignored. It lived in routine, discipline, and endurance. And while the desks, machines, and titles have changed, the quiet expectations they navigated continue to echo in modern work culture. Remembering this is not about returning to the past or idealizing it. It is about understanding how easily effort can be mistaken for ease, and how often stability depends on people who are trained not to be seen. When we notice that pattern, we begin to question it. And when we question it, we create space for work to be recognized not only for what it produces, but for what it requires. Thank you for spending this time with me, and for listening to a story that moves slowly, quietly, and deliberately. If you found calm in it, or reflection, or simply a moment of stillness, then it has done its job. Take care, rest well, and I will see you again in the next story.